Late afternoon sunlight slanted across the marina, gilding the hulls of idle yachts and draping the old wooden pier in shadows. A warm breeze carried the faint scent of salt and varnish, and somewhere in the distance, a halyard clinked softly against a tall mast. The Yacht Club had changed over the years, some of the grand old boats replaced with sleeker, newer models, the gardens around the clubhouse grown a bit wild, but the hush of wealth and old secrets remained. It was quieter now, as the season's end approached and the summer crowd thinned to a few loyal regulars. Yet, beneath that hush, something stirred. The lingering echoes of choices made long ago. I sat on a low bench that overlooked the water, my hands folded in my lap, and the weight of unspoken memories pressing upon my heart. A dry bitterness at the back of my throat reminded me of my youth, how I once stood behind that high-polished bar inside, pouring drinks I could never afford to sample. That was decades ago, before regrets and misunderstandings had sent me drifting from one place to another. Now I had returned, not as the confident young bartender I once was, but as a man uncertain of his place in the world. Time had granted me wisdom, but it had also brought loss of old friends, loss of direction. I couldn't help recalling how I had once told a young friend about my past. When I was in my 20s, I worked on the bar at a very fancy yacht club, I had said, trying to convey how surreal it had felt to stand amidst such opulence. I was an oak in that field, but I got the job through an acquaintance. What's my point? There were millionaire clients, they dressed very simply and didn't brag about their successes. Billionaires wore mass-market sandals and didn't stand out. I had paused there, remembering a particular face. And there was this one dude, always unshaven and in cheap t-shirts. He sat and talked to the bartenders about life. It wasn't till 2 years later that I found out that this dude was the richest guy there. He even gave money to the owner of the yacht club to keep him afloat. It didn't work out, by the way. I remember that man vividly. His quiet chuckle, the way he seemed more at home slumping over a bar stool than reclining on a luxury yacht. The memory had lingered because it challenged what I thought I knew about class and worth. Now, decades on, I could feel that same uneasy sense of not knowing who truly stood before me. I had come back here with a purpose, to untangle the threads of my past and find something like closure. But the day was only just fading, and the familiar murmur of voices drifting from the clubhouse door suggested I wasn't the only one who had returned. Unbeknownst to me, just behind the beveled glass doors and time-stained beams, a series of events had already begun to unfold. Soon, a handful of souls, strangers, or so it would seem, would intersect in ways none of us could have imagined, exposing hidden links and unhealed wounds. For now, I waited, a bittersweet ache tightening my chest. The setting sun reflected off the gently rocking water, and I felt the weight of old decisions pressing in. Something was coming, an unexpected twist, perhaps. I took a deep breath, allowing the scent of the sea to center me. The final days of summer were upon us, and with them came the promise of revelations and the possibility of a long-overdue redemption. The dusk settled softly, and I decided to step inside, drawn by a sense of urgency that seemed to tingle along my nerves. The old teak doors groaned slightly on their hinges, revealing a room lit by muted amber lamps. I passed the bar where I had once worked, the counter now polished as ever, but worn at the edges, as if history had pressed its fingerprints into the grain. A few patrons lingered at the far end, hunched over their glasses, talking in low, reverent tones as if the place were a chapel. Beyond them, the windows framed the shimmering marina and distant lights dancing on the waves. As I scanned the room, I noticed a woman at a table near the large bay windows. She looked as if she were waiting for someone, her posture poised, yet there was a tremor in the way she touched her necklace. Beside her, the chair remained empty, a silent invitation. A hushed tension clung to her figure, and I couldn't help feeling a pang of empathy. Outside, a seagull cried, startling a few patrons who glanced over their shoulders as if expecting someone. The catalyst came when a stranger entered, an older man, shoulders slightly stooped, wearing a faded linen blazer and trousers that had seen better days. He approached the bar, nodded at no one in particular, and then drifted toward the woman at the window. A flicker of recognition crossed her face, but it wasn't a happy one. She stood abruptly, nearly upsetting her drink, eyes brimming with a complexity of emotion. Fear, longing, anger. Before I could make sense of it, the door opened again, admitting a younger man, hair disheveled and clothing rumpled, who moved with a sense of nervous energy that crackled around him. He hesitated, scanning the room, as if searching for a face he both dreaded and needed to see. His gaze slid past me without a hint of recognition. He looked so familiar. Was it the eyes, or the way he carried himself? I couldn't place him. Not yet. Then the unexpected connection formed. The younger man approached the same table by the window. His voice broke through the hush in a strained whisper. "It's you," he breathed, addressing both the woman and the older man. The air felt charged, like the moment before a lightning strike. In that electric silence, they all stood as if on a fragile bridge suspended over years of regret. I couldn't help myself. I moved closer, drawn by that quiet drama. Through a gap in the crowd, I saw the older man clench his hands. The woman pressed her lips together, fighting tears. And the younger man, his face was awash in turmoil, as if he just dug through layers of memory he never wanted to touch again. They looked so different from one another, three strangers divided by age, appearance, and station. Yet something about their faces reminded me of the wealthy yachtsman I'd known years ago, the one who wore cheap t-shirts and spoke kindly to bartenders. Was this somehow connected to him, or to the past I had thought I'd left behind? I listened intently, though their voices were low. A mention of debts, a name uttered beneath the breath, and the sound of a glass rattling on the table. Outside, a gust of wind rattled the window panes, as if urging them to speak more clearly. Inside me, a long-quieted curiosity flared. Something important was happening here. Something that might just cast a new light on all I thought I understood about the old Yacht Club and the people who once gathered beneath its vaulted ceilings. In that charged moment, a link began to form in my mind. I felt as though I were peering at the knots in a half-finished tapestry, sensing that these three individuals, so distinct, so guarded, were inextricably woven into a pattern that spanned decades. None of us knew yet how tightly we were bound, nor how this night would lead to revelations we had never dared to imagine. From my discreet vantage by the bar's corner, I watched the trio struggle through a silence weighted with old grievances. The older man, still gripping the chair back, tried to meet the woman's eyes, but she looked away, folding her arms protectively across her chest. The younger man hovered between them, torn and unsure. His lips parted as if he longed to speak but didn't know where to begin. At last, the woman broke the silence, her voice trembling yet firm. "I thought we agreed never to meet here again." She touched the necklace at her throat, turning it over as though searching for comfort in its delicate shape. "This place, it holds too many ghosts." The older man sighed, lines deepening around his eyes. "I didn't choose this," he said quietly. "I have as many regrets as you do. I never imagined we'd be forced back into the same room." His words contained a sorrow I recognized, the tone of one who has failed despite doing his utmost, and now struggles under the weight of old wounds. The younger man shifted, rubbing the back of his neck. "I never understood why it had to be this way." He looked at both of them in turn, frustration tightening his jaw. "All those stories I heard as a boy, about fortunes made, debts forgiven, kindnesses granted without strings. You told me everyone here had long forgotten who they were before their wealth, that no one would ever reveal what they truly wanted." He lowered his voice, bitterness edging in. Was it just a lie? This last question shocked me. I realized that he, too, recalled something of the old days, a time when the richest among us dressed in shabby shirts and simple sandals, offering quiet counsel rather than flaunting their worth. The tone of his words hinted that he knew about the one who had propped up the club, the secret benefactor whose generosity failed to save its legacy. I stepped closer, half hidden in shadows, remembering the wealthy man's weary kindness as he sat at my bar decades ago. How had these three come to represent such tangled threads of that past? The woman leaned forward, voice wavering. It wasn't a lie. We made choices we thought were right. When the club was sinking, we took his help. We never asked who he really was or what it would cost us, because we were too desperate to care. Her eyes darted to the older man, a look of old complicity passing between them. He saved us once, and we paid him back with silence and avoidance. It's no wonder he disappeared without a word. The older man cleared his throat. You know as well as I do that he never wanted recognition. He was the quiet one at the end of the bar. Do you remember? He searched the woman's face for understanding. He listened to everyone's troubles, tried to keep the place afloat when no one else would step forward. When the club failed anyway, we all scattered like leaves in the wind, no one willing to admit the truth. The younger man clenched his fists. So you both knew him? You knew the man I've heard about only in whispers. This unassuming figure who held everything together at the seams. And you never told me? A painful hush fell over them. The woman swallowed hard. We didn't know how to explain. We owed him so much but gave him so little in return. When he vanished, we assumed it was for good reason. Maybe we'd wounded him more than we realized. I felt the old ache in my chest deepen. They were speaking of the same quiet billionaire I had served all those summers ago. The memory of his face flashed through my mind. How kind his eyes were. How he always asked about my day rather than boasting about his own. In that moment, as the three before me quarreled, I realized we all carried fragments of his legacy, scattered like shards of broken glass. We had misunderstood his silence, misread his simplicity, and now bore the consequences. The younger man's voice lowered to a whisper. I'm tired of not knowing. I've carried these stories my whole life. Rumors, half-truths, and questions. I need answers. Why did he help? Why did he vanish? And why are we standing here now, after all these years, still pretending we don't owe him something more than empty gratitude? The woman covered her face with one trembling hand, tears slipping through her fingers. The older man closed his eyes as if bracing for a blow. They were all bound by secrets that had festered too long. From across the room, I could almost taste their regret. The silence that followed was thick, and it seemed that every sail outside went limp, every ripple on the water stilled, as though the world itself held its breath. In that fragile pause, I knew we were on the brink of something. Whether it would be truth or further pain depended on whether any of us would finally be brave enough to speak honestly. But for now, there was no resolution. Only the weight of what had been left unsaid for decades, pressing down on them, and on me, like a tide slowly rising in the dark. A sudden gust of wind rattled the window panes, and for a moment, a barware chime sounded at the counter, like a distant bell tolling the hour of truth. I stepped out of the shadows, drawn forward by a compulsion I couldn't resist. My shoes clicked on the old wooden floor, and 3 sets of eyes turned to me, curious, wary, and wounded. I realized they did not recognize me. After all, decades had passed, and I had changed as much as this place had. But they needed a witness who remembered, someone who carried the old threads of this tapestry in his hands. The older man straightened, protective. Can we help you? His voice held a note of caution, yet his eyes flickered with uneasy recognition, as if he saw something familiar in the lines of my face. I cleared my throat, my voice quieter than I intended. I used to work here, a long time ago, behind the bar when this club was at its height. I served all of you once, or people like you. I nodded to the woman and the younger man in turn. Their faces remained tense, but they listened. I know the man you speak of. The one who gave money to the owner, tried to keep the place afloat. The one who wore simple clothes and never bragged. I paused, feeling the old hurt surface. He asked about my family, my dreams, my struggles. He cared, in a way none of the others did. The younger man's shoulders loosened fractionally. You knew him? His voice carried a desperate hope. I nodded. He was kind to me, and I never understood why someone so wealthy could remain so quiet about it. He taught me that money doesn't define a person's worth. Only years later did I learn who he really was. By then, it was too late. He had gone. A hush settled again, but it was different this time, warmer, more expectant. The woman lowered her hand from her face, eyes glistening. Then maybe you know more than we do. We've each carried our guilt differently, but none of us truly grasped what he wanted from us. Why he chose to help and then leave us to sort out the ruins. The older man's voice was ragged as he spoke. I was the one he trusted with the final documents. I never told anyone. The shame of failing him, of watching this place he tried to save crumble into debt, ate away at me. I feared the truth would only make others resent him or me. So I said nothing. The younger man looked at the woman. And you? I grew up hearing whispery tales of a humble patron who could have saved everything if only people had seen him for who he was. I never realized you knew him personally. She inhaled deeply, blinking back tears. I had my reasons to stay silent. My family had a history here. This place was meant to be passed down through generations. When he offered help, we accepted without question, but we never gave him what he truly needed. Our recognition of who he was as a person, not just a source of funds. I should have thanked him, but I was too proud. She touched her necklace again, and the lamplight revealed an inscription on the pendant that I hadn't noticed before. It was small, barely visible, but as she caught my gaze and nodded, I leaned closer. The inscription bore the initials of the generous man, a gift he had once pressed into her hand, urging her to believe in a future beyond wealth, a future of understanding and compassion. The sight of it plucked at my memory. He had spoken often of legacy, of how kindness, not currency, shaped the course of one's life. A tremor passed through me, and I realized the greatest truth hidden here. We were not just strangers haunted by the same ghost. We were pieces of his past, each holding a fragment of his spirit. He had given them money and faith. He had given me patience and wisdom. He had given the younger man a story, a legend to measure the world by. And we had all failed him in some way, by keeping silent, by running away, by not acknowledging the purity of his intentions. I think I know why he left, I said quietly. He didn't want repayment in money or favors. He wanted understanding. Perhaps he hoped that by showing kindness in a world obsessed with wealth, he could inspire a quiet revolution of empathy. When that didn't happen, when the club fell and everyone scattered, he had no reason to remain. The younger man swallowed hard. Then what now? We cannot summon him back. We cannot fix what fell apart. The older man placed a gentle hand on the younger man's shoulder. But we can honor him. We can share his story truthfully. We can learn that wealth means nothing without compassion. We can forgive each other, and ourselves, for missing what was right in front of us. The woman's voice came soft but sure. We can remember him not as a savior or a mysterious benefactor, but as a human being who tried to heal wounds larger than himself. In that moment, the knot loosened. The walls seemed to breathe, and through the window we could see that the wind had stilled, the boats drifting lazily against the twilight sky. Our understanding of him, of ourselves, was changing. In the silence that followed, we held the weight of truth and felt it shift, becoming lighter somehow. We had reached the threshold of redemption. All that remained was to decide how to cross it. They seemed unsure how to move forward, like three travelers who had arrived, together yet apart, at the same quiet clearing in a long and complicated journey. A hushed stillness enveloped us, a kind of reverence for the truths now laid bare. I let the silence linger before speaking. There's no way to erase the past. I began, my voice steady. We all made choices, some out of fear, others out of pride. But he gave us a gift. He showed us that empathy is more valuable than status, and that deeds done in quiet generosity can echo longer than any boast. The older man nodded slowly, and in his lined face I saw relief tempered by sorrow. I kept his papers hidden all these years, his letters, his offers, his handwritten notes to the club's staff. I never destroyed them, though I was tempted. Perhaps I always knew I would need to share them one day, to prove the truth of who he was and what he hoped to inspire. He paused, pressing the bridge of his nose as if staving off tears. I'll make them public, or at least show them to anyone who cares to know. Let his words speak for themselves. The woman reached for the younger man's hand, surprising them both. Though uncertain, he didn't pull away. My family was entrusted with a legacy of privilege we never truly understood, she said, voice soft but determined. If I have any influence left, I will use it to shape a place, here or elsewhere, where people are seen as people first, not as wallets or trophies. I will share his story, make sure others know that there once was a man who gave quietly, without expectation, and that we can still learn from him. The younger man, eyes wet, took a shaky breath. I've spent so much of my life chasing phantoms, trying to understand why some people give and others take, why fortunes rise and fall. Maybe I can do something meaningful now. I can keep his memory alive in how I choose to live, with more humility and more care for others. Their resolve knitted together in that dimly lit space. 3 people who had arrived in bitterness and confusion now stood shoulder to shoulder, quietly pledging to move forward with honesty and gratitude. I watched them and felt something loosen in my own heart. I recalled long ago evenings when I polished glasses at the bar, listening to that kind stranger speak kindly of life's fragility. It was as though his voice, never raised above a murmur, had finally been heard. As we stepped toward the window, the marina lay serene beneath a sky dotted with early stars. The reflection of distant lights on the water reminded me that time moves, dissolving old wounds and allowing new beginnings. We said little after that, just stood close, letting the silence turn from sorrowful to hopeful. They would each leave tonight carrying a piece of him, our quiet benefactor, within their hearts, and in that way he would live on. Before parting, the woman bowed her head. "I'm sorry," she whispered, to no one and to everyone, tears shining in her eyes. The older man gently touched her shoulder, his silence full of understanding. The younger man managed a tentative smile, a small but courageous gesture that hinted at forgiveness and the strength it takes to accept what cannot be undone. I left them standing there, 3 changed souls, their secrets no longer weighing them down but guiding them toward a better understanding of themselves and others. Outside, as I walked along the pier, the boards creaked softly under my feet, and the yachts rocked gently as if nodding in approval. The wind carried a faint scent of possibility. In my mind, I saw the quiet billionaire once more, slumped on a bar stool, a thoughtful half-smile on his face, offering patient counsel to a younger version of me. And for the first time, I smiled back, grateful for the lessons I had finally learned. The world felt wider than before, and though loss had touched us all, we had gained something immeasurable. A kind of redemptive understanding, a spark of humility, and the courage to move forward. In the gentle hush of the marina's twilight, we had found transformation.